Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jo Davish. I'm the Executive Director here at the Georgia Center for the Book. And on behalf of the Georgia Center for the Book, the Decatur Arts Alliance, the DeKalb County Public Library, and the DeKalb Library Foundation, welcome to our first in a series of artist talks for The Book as Art, Transformation. This year presented on the fourth floor gallery of the Decatur Library. Before we begin our presentation this evening, just a few reminders. If you'd like to ask a question of any of our artists after the formal presentation, feel free to do so by either typing it into the chat, which we will monitor throughout the program, or by using the Q&A feature. You'll find the Q&A button at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on your device. Please click on that button and then type in your questions so we can answer them in turn. Also, we have enabled the closed captioning for our hearing impaired patrons. You can find the CC button at the top or the bottom of your screen, and by clicking it, you can modify the font size to make reading easier for you. We'd also like to remind you that you can sign up for gallery hours to come see the wonderful artworks in Book as Art Transformation at the Decatur Library on Tuesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. Or you can request a special viewing time and we can try to accommodate you. We'd also like to remind you that all of the pieces in the show this year are available for purchase, with a portion of those proceeds going to support the Decatur Arts Alliance. You can make those purchases by contacting the Decatur Arts Alliance. So we have a very, very special presentation for you this evening featuring 4 of the artists coming to you from Maine, Seattle, Washington, Brooklyn, New York, and while traveling through Tennessee. They're going to be sharing with you presentations, a bit of insight into their work and their working habits, and some are going to give you a peek into their studios. Right now, I'm going to introduce the authors in alphabetical order, and then we'll start the presentations. With a long career as a commercial, portrait, and fine art photographer, Sharon Gottula discovered the magic of encaustic painting in 2010, which changed the course of her work forever. With properties of wax and demargum, she could take her work from behind the glass frame and creative multimedia 3D narrative pieces that went beyond the divisive mold of Cartier-Bresson. My work has always been about the story, exploring topics such as climate change, human nature, and the ever-hastening passage of time. A graduate of San Francisco State University, she earned her bachelor's in fine art with an emphasis in photography. An active member of San Francisco photography scene, she was involved at San Francisco Camera Work and the Ansel Adams Society. In 1991, she moved to Paris, France, working as a portrait photographer. It was there that she began exploring the environmental impact of modern life. Back in the States, while raising a young family, she renewed her fine art practice with Roadside Blooms, an exploration of diversity of wildflowers and a conversation about what differentiates a plant from a weed. Currently in Seattle, she practices her art includes photography, encaustic paintings, and bookmaking. And I apologize, my electricity seems to be flickering here, so hopefully I will get through all of these introductions. Miranda Maher has lived in Brooklyn, New York since 1991. She received her master's in the fine arts from Cranbrook Academy of Art and her bachelor's in the fine arts from Rhode Island School of Design. Her studio practice has traveled a varied path over 30 years that includes installations, artist books, and work on paper looking at warfare, violence, and the human exploitation of the natural world, as well as more contemplative explorations of consciousness and embodiment. Her current work centers on ink, collage, gilding, and drawing on paper, as well as unique and editioned books. Next is Colleen Mullins, a photographer and book artist. She has garnered numerous grants and fellowships, including 2 McKnight Fellowships, 4 Minnesota State Arts Boards grants, and in 2020, she was a nominee for the Alicia Oscar Banek Award for her project, Expositions Are Timekeepers of Progress. Additionally, she has been an artist in resident at the Vermont Studio Center, the Penland School of Crafts Winter Residency, and In Cahoots Residency. Mullins' work is in collections of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, Ogden Museum of Southern Art, and the Southeast Museum of Photography, among others. Her publications include Photo District News, the Oxford American Eyes on the South, the New York Times Lens blog, and numerous textbooks. She has authored articles for Afterimage and PD Needu. Recent exhibitions include the Griffin Museum of Photographic Art, the North Carolina Museum of Art, and the Tilt Institute for Contemporary Image with the Rolls and Tubes Collective. She lives and works in San Francisco, but is currently living out of her Ford Transit Connect, making pictures and storytelling tradition of Steinbeck's travels with Charlie in Search of America. Showing an early interest in book arts, Joelle Webber has the good fortune to learn from many talents in the field. She began her career providing binding support in other studios. She earned a certificate degree from the Iowa Center for the Book, then home to set up her home studio. Tucked in the heart of Mid-Coast Maine, Mermaid Bindery offers limited edition artist books along with bookbinding and box building services for fellow creators. Mermaid Bindery traveled throughout Maine, selling at fairs while continuing to bind for clients at home. Transitioning away from craft work towards artist books, Joelle combines her almost 40 years of collected binding techniques with her love of philosophy, nature, writing, and sculpture. So please join me to welcome all of our guests this evening, and we'll start off with Sharon Gottula. Sharon?
Thank you, Joe. I am excited to be here presenting with Miranda, Colleen, and Joelle today. I happened to be traveling on the East Coast last month and took a detour and came down to Decatur. So I got to see the show in person. And if you have a chance to see it, do it. It's amazing. You will not regret it. Today, I'll be talking a bit about my journey using encaustic medium and discuss the meaning of glacial movement, my book and the show, and then show you the rest of the series of the books. Have you ever woken up with a complete vision of something so real you could actually feel it? Fragile Breath, the first book in the Encyclopedia of Extinction, came to me just like that, fully formed, ready to be created. When Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, it felt so surreal, like something that would have happened 100 years ago. In the middle of the night, I woke up and I had this vision of blood spilling and soaking into the earth, and the soldiers' spirits rising up, disappearing into the atmosphere. And I couldn't shake this vision of a ghost-like book filled with empty pages. My background is in commercial photography, and I worked in Los Angeles for 15 years. I specialized in food photography and got to travel the country working with restaurants and chefs. 2010 found me as a stay-at-home mom with 2 kids living in Kansas City. One day at a local gallery, I saw this amazing painting, and I asked Paul, the gallery owner, "What is that painting made from?" And he turned to me and said, "That's encaustic." You could say it was love at first sight. And since that day, I've been exploring and learning about this unique medium. I started out using encaustic to get my photography out from behind the glass. I attached my photos onto wood panels and then painted the encaustic on top. This sealed in and protected the original photo, and then I could add texture and color on top. Then I started to experiment with collage. Encaustic is an excellent medium for combining different materials. With the wax, you can embed elements like this vintage carousel slide holder here. As I gained more and more knowledge of how this medium works, I began using encaustic painting as my primary vehicle for my work. And I started delving more and more into abstraction. If you've never heard of encaustic, you're not alone. It's not the most well-known medium like acrylic or oil. It's been around since the 5th century BC, and it's most famously associated with the Fayum mummy portraits. The medium is durable and highly archival. Encaustic medium is a combination of beeswax and damar resin. I buy most of my paints already colored, but I have made my own paints, mixing in raw pigments, graphite, and even charcoal from a fire. In order to paint with encaustic, you need to transform it into a liquid state, which happens at about 180 degrees Fahrenheit. So instead of a typical painter's palette, I use a pancake griddle, and I get to use a blowtorch to fuse the wax, which is really fun. It can be a bit of a tricky medium to work with, and it's easy to overheat and ruin your work, but it's also really forgiving with ultimate do-overs because you can always warm up the wax and scrape away anything you don't like and start right over. Now, encaustic usually needs a porous material to stick to, like wood or paper or clay. It doesn't usually adhere to acrylic or glass for that matter. But by preparing the surface with sanding and applying a gritty gesso, I can create enough tooth to the surface for the wax to attach, and it enables me to get this translucent look on acrylic, very similar to these 13th century painted windows. When I start a new project, I typically like to begin with some stream of conscious writing, which allows me to ramble on and discover themes, keywords, and helps me transform that spark of an idea into a plan. Then I start playing around with thumbnail sketches using watercolor or acrylic. Here are some of my preliminary composition ideas for Fragile Breath. And then here I'm playing with metal leaf and ink, testing out ideas that turned into unintended consequences. The Encyclopedia of Extinction is made up of 5 books. Now, I've been passionate about environmental conservation for a very long time, and each book is an ode to how we are destroying ourselves by making our planet inhospitable. When we talk of climate change or logging or strip mining, we usually talk about the destruction of the planet, but the planet is going to be around for a couple more million years. What we don't really talk about is how we're poisoning ourselves, like in Flint, Michigan, or destroying our habitat as water levels rise and storms get stronger, like the devastation from Hurricane Ian. Glacial movement is the 3rd in the series, and as you probably can tell by the name, it's all about climate change, specifically the melting glaciers and the glacial progress of climate change policy. With the interior pages, I wanted to focus on glaciers transitioning from icy white to watery blues. I don't know why this isn't playing. Might be a little lag. It's supposed to be a video. As you transition through the pages, they transform from white to watery blue, and then finally to earthy greens and browns of the land beneath them. I use this Japanese paper called tengucho for its ethereal quality. However, it's very lightweight and becomes fragile with wet media. So I chose to color these pages using handmade transfer papers of earth pigments that I mixed with alcohol, and then used a variety of mark making tools to transfer the color onto the pages. Now, I'm a big thrift store junkie, much to my husband's dismay, and I have a bin of tools that I've been collecting that makes interesting marks. I use everything from combs to pasta cutters, old forks. I especially love this pink sewing marker that creates dotted lines. And this beaten up honeycomb metal grid is a leftover from my photography days. I use these same tools to create marks into the caustic wax. I can then fill them in with impressions with oil paint or ink to bring out the textures. You can see here how this technique creates lines and dotted patterns in the encaustic and how the paint really brings out the details. With Scarred Scared Earth, the cover has this scar-like pattern on the front that was created by adding in texture and then filling it in with oil paint. And with each book of the series, you'll find unique interior pages that were chosen to enhance the theme of the cover artwork. I like to think of the pages sort of as the backup singers. Scarred Scared Earth speaks to how countries create conflicts to gain rights to ports or minerals. So the interior pages are dyed with these handmade inks of copper and iron. With handmade ink, sometimes you get surprising effects. And the copper ink here creates this interesting speckled effect because of how the metal is combining with the salt mordant. Unearthed Consequences goes further with the mining concept, how we are destroying large parts of the earth mining for precious metals. The interior pages transition from minimal calligraphic marks that become larger and darker as the page progresses. And as you leaf through the book, gold ink hash marks appear and gradually fill up the pages. This could be read as a financial tally or perhaps the marks of imprisonment. The newest book in the series is Separated Forest, which delves into the interconnectivity between the air, forest, and water of our planet, and how pollution is affecting this cycle. The interior pages have black and white infrared images of trees and clouds and water. By printing on the Tengucho paper, the images transform into this ghostly impression of what the photographs actually look like. My hope for this series is not to solely focus on the negative aspects about what is happening to the planet, but really, like all of my previous work, my focus is on slowing down, cherishing what we have, and making small changes today for a better life tomorrow. You can find more about the Encyclopedia of Extinction and my work by visiting my website, SharonGottula.com, and you can always find me on Instagram at Sharon Gottula Studios. Thank you so much.
Well, I am, one moment, I need to see what I'm showing you. I'm zooming in from Brooklyn in my studio, and I was thinking about how to narrow down what I present to you. With 30 years of stuff can get tricky. But it was a wonderful opportunity because as I sifted through what's here, I realized that even before the last couple of years where I've really focused on collage work, literal collage work, my work has always done that. In the 1990s, I was much more directly, let's say, annoyed by and inspired by human violence and making work about that, especially work about how we fool ourselves into thinking, we're not that violent, it's okay, or that violence was far away, far back in time. And I want to take a risk here and move my camera around. I hope that I don't make you seasick, but I think that's the easiest way to do this. So starting on this wall with work that is a little older. Let's see what I got here. So these three scrolls here are all older work. This scroll on the bottom is the one I would like to call your attention to. That is an artist book that I have the addition to many times after research. It's a timeline of humans from to the edition. This one is 2020. And combines this decorative surface. My idea is that I'm trying to seduce you to spending more time with our species families, because we tend to. Below that are 1,000 coordinates of violence, which is another treatment of the same that I have. We have history, don't enough to change. Next to it is first the data book of red vowels. So here I've collaged girl rape names with rape statistics, with the Christian book Hours, which in medieval times was the 5 star. So that's there's a lot of other work. I think I editioned about 15 artist books in the 90s. All of them were, most of them very humble material. and made to be distributed at the least possible expense. But I guess around 1998, I became a little tired, weary of living with this history, and I started shifting. I still was dealing with our habit of self-deception. I started to think of dreams, take a tinge perhaps of nature or dry. So these two up here are, middle one is the Hudson River, and the top one is actually 3 rivers. It's 33 feet long, straightened out, drawn end to end. And they are my favorite rivers from my childhood. I'm going to try and come a little more. So down on this table, you see 3 books from another series, which is also a little more personal. It's my own violence. I took 24 books that had been silenced or censored them. So I methodically destroyed the text. This one is burned. This one is cut. This one is metal, silver, gold. But nonetheless, they're all silenced. And none of these books are currently censored. So things like Descartes' writing, fiction from the 19th century. So I'm going to turn this around. These 3 rivers are more recent. So shifting even further from trying to understand our relationship to violence and how we cannot change it, I've moved really to the moment of being alive. Very, very basic, making a mark on paper and combining that mark with various things. So this series of 6 different rivers combines the path of the river. Rivers are drawn very much like sumi or shodo, where I'm in a open-minded state and I'm moving brush, following a map more or less, combining that with a line of physics equations. And then along the river at the appropriate place, I've also penciled in human cities. So we have 3 timelines here. One is cosmic time, as represented by the physics equations. We have Earth time of the rivers, and I would say it's drawn in pencil, so the least permanent is the human time of the human cities. So some other experiments in collage. These are from Home Improvement is the name of the series. It's a series of 9 abandoned bird nests. And each one is decorated or improved with fancy fashion labels. Being a bit tongue-in-cheek, so that kind of aligning the birds with human ideas of the way we try to improve ourselves or our home with fashion and fancy things. So the most subtle so far of collaging, I think, is the book that's in the show. And this is called Crotch. And basically what I did was I abstractly drew in ink on 27 sheets of handmade paper. And then I folded them into signatures and had them professionally bound by an annual report binder, actually, so that each half sheet is collaged with another half sheet. I intentionally use this very business-like binding and silver embossed title to create a tension with the title. And I could have titled it Gutter or Binding, but instead I wanted to make a connection to the human body, and I wanted to use that rather coarse word choice just to really have it's almost like a tease juxtaposition. So I would say overall my work is unique books when I'm called to make one. Edition books is more historical, and those are the containers that work the best for me to contain those investigations of human violence in most cases. And then my studio work that's not books is collaging and ink, combining kind of that direct ink, brush, paper with other elements that are more ornate or less direct. I think that's it for me, unless there are questions.
Good evening. Thank you, Allie and Joe, and your great organizations for being such gracious hosts to all of us. And I'm honored to be speaking with Joelle, Miranda, and Sharon. I'm gonna show some slides, so no attention to the man behind the curtain. Okay, there we go. I've been making books for about 30 years and photographs for 40. In this exhibition, I have 2 works, and I decided to just focus on those tonight. One of which is a fully realized project of my own, and one for which I am one of 4 artists for whom I created a deluxe edition of a trade artist book we made in 2021. I'll talk about them tonight. The latter, even though I was one of my own 4 clients, was my first foray into being directed and beholden to others and making a book object. So I'm going to start there. My first piece came out of a self-publishing project done with photographs with 3 of my colleagues, Christy McDonald, Jenny Sampson, and Nicole White. Completed in extended lockdowns in 2020 and 2021. Briefly, the project involved remaking the history of photography, utilizing toilet paper as a compositional tool in a kind of Rochambeau game that played out on Instagram. And the fancy website came later. I hope it's not such distant history that we've forgotten the toilet paper shortage of 2020, but that's where it all came from. There are well over 100 images in the overall project. The trade edition had a selection of 40 of the images, and we named ourselves the Rolls and Tubes Collective after an important exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in 1978 called Mirrors and Windows. It was a survey of contemporary photography from 1960 on, and had 101 artists, 15 of which were women and fewer of color. The piece in the exhibition is the deluxe edition, which I mentioned, and I designed and fabricated it. It's a clamshell box, and I made it with a cover image in mind because of the strong tie to the eye in photography. I wanted to further emphasize this feature inside, and this photograph on the cover is by Nicole White after Pierson. Picking up on the theme of toilet paper, water imagery is featured on the paste downs. And the viewer removes the small portfolio with a wrap that has toilet paper patterns on the edges. Inside is a wrapper that's revealed, and there's a little colophon there. And inside of the wrapper are 4 5x7-inch photographic prints, one by each of us. And that cover image you're seeing is by Christy McDonald. Below the portfolio is a peekaboo false floor, and that can be removed, revealing a copy of the trade edition of our book. The trade edition was designed by the masterful Bob Awfuldish, a wonderful photo book designer. It is a box of flashcards where the viewer is invited to try and guess the original from which the toilet paper version is derived. The cards were delivered in the order in which the originals fell in the history of photography. But the text invites the viewer to remake that history in any way they choose, as we photographers did again and again with our project. And this is an example of what the actual flashcards look like. And this is my rendition of one of Anna Atkins' pieces, Ilaria Escalenta. And this is my other piece in the exhibition. So this is more in keeping of what I usually do. So the title, Expositions Are the Timekeepers of Progress, was a sentence uttered in a speech delivered by President William McKinley at the Pan American Exposition on September 5th, 1901, a day before being assassinated by Leon Schollgotz. It's important to start here because the reason there are statues to a president that most of this audience outside of Buffalo or Canton probably don't know much about, and McKinley is who this work is about, or rather, a town in the northern bit of California that became the site of the first removal of a presidential statue ever. The card wrapper is a hand-cut reveal that is taken from one of my photographs of this McKinley statue's pedestal. Inside the wrapper are 2 panels, one with a colophon and index of archival material used throughout, and another with an artist statement. The book is a fully cased double fan binding, and it's all archival inkjet prints, including tipped in materials which are hand cut to look like authentic news clippings, etc. I should also mention that in 2018, the reason I got involved in this was I was on a sabbatical replacement teaching at Humboldt State University in Arcata when all of this was happening. So in 2018, after 112 years of intermittent attempts to remove said statue from its plaza, Arcata, California mounted its last campaign against the Union volunteer slain president. The town hall meetings were so contentious, city planners started using butcher paper and Post-it notes to lessen the din in meetings. I photographed these and used them several different ways throughout the book, but this precedes the title page. And it's pretty much an encapsulation of not only this battle, but the battles that are playing out throughout the country since 2016 really is when this current spate began through today. And the one on the left says, keep statue on plaza, but provide plaque with historical context, history of McKinley, pros and cons of legacy, artist info, etc. And on the right, an arrow pointing to the first Post-it and just, Wiat trauma is not worth your fucking education, read a book. There are 2 things you need to know about those Post-its. The Wiat tribe endured a brutal massacre on Tuluwat Island near Arcata in 1860. 300, mostly women, elderly, and children were bludgeoned, as using rifles would have alerted them and made easier escape of any kind. Wiat trauma is incredibly real and present, especially in this community. And it's one of the worst things that I've ever researched or read. And the other thing that you need to know is that William McKinley was 17 in 1860, and he never set foot in Arcata, California. When I asked one of my colleagues why the statue was in the plaza, and if this was the President McKinley, as there's a town called McKinleyville just north of there, and they're known for logging, so maybe a logger. She didn't know. When I asked a stranger and then another why he had to go, I heard everything from he was a local slave trader to being responsible for the v.10 massacre, even the Trail of Tears. McKinley joined the Union Army in June of 1861. History is complicated and ever evolving as a beast. He was also responsible for brutal imperialist actions that made the US an empire, something that was celebrated at the time, things we now view with a post-colonialist eye as the wrong-hearted things they were. I was hooked, but who wants to see 40 pictures of a statue? So my investigations are varied, trying to capture the scope of the thing itself and the amazing social and political history of the man and the metal. So photographically, I started trying to make images in the region that were representative of malleable histories and change as metaphor. And the Post-its became the voices of contemporary Arcadians. I also spent a lot of time in the Humboldt State University archives looking at historical images, news clippings, and even notes that they had from decades old town council meetings on the subject of the statue. There was really a great librarian there. I mean, everything was kept. Here we see a memorial service held for McKinley at Humboldt County Courthouse in 1901. This emerges in enlarged form repeatedly throughout the piece. Also, in lieu of 36 views of McKinley, I tried to add imagery that evoked environmental characters of the county, like fog or logging or marijuana production. This is one of the main statue removal advocates in a self-determined moment facing sit-down City Hall, the irony of his appropriated motion on full view. On the left is a reproduced speech made to the town council in the early 1990s about why the statue should be removed. I placed these items in the, for the viewer to discover, having lengthy text blocks within the piece to make it a discovery rather than a didactic, I suppose. The letter reveals a clue to the opinions of townfolk today. That muddled history of McKinley there was often mixed with a man who paid, the legacy of McKinley himself is mixed with the legacy of the man who paid to erect the statue. He was legitimately a guy with a very bad relationship with his indigenous neighbors. I should mention here that the statue itself turns out to have had an amazing path to Arcata. It happened to be at the foundry in San Francisco in April of 1906, complete and waiting transport when the great earthquake happened. And the workers rushed to the foundry to grab their personal belongings, seeing the fires nearing the area. And they all knew they had to drag the statue out to the street and save it. And this is a bit of poetic license in the story. Anarchist Emma Goldman was briefly detained and as a co-conspirator after Scholgatz took the assassin's shot. At the time, she was depicted side by side in memorial accounts of the slain president's life constantly. And in fact, she quickly condemned the assassination, not because he was assassinating the president, but the president was a bad target. Finally, the statue here reflected in the Plaza Bar where I interviewed many of the townsfolks. The social history of the statue is really important to my interest in the controversy. The town had a long history of treating it as a mascot. For every festival and every holiday, he endured adornment, dressed as an angel or Neptune, depending on the occasion. Some tenacious librarian at Humboldt State cut out news clippings for everyone. And of course, we must say thank goodness for librarians in that moment. But there was also the proximity of a college dormitory to endure. This involved the rite of passage of climbing McKinley. Halloween apparently involved Mardi Gras-like breast flashing at the top. To the point that one year, town council minutes reveal a former police chief suggested greasing him to prevent mounting. And then there was the time the police detained a man who had climbed the statue and stuffed cheese into its nose and mouth. Sorry. Nose and ears. Here, to allude to this story, I laser printed McKinley's visage on processed cheese food, and another post-it. This time, the photograph is reproduced onto post-it material, so it's a physical object, and it gives the voice a little bit louder reason. And there are actually two voices on this post-it. One is melt it down and make it into something not harmful, and then the other one is I like that. Here, a two-page spread depicts a hand sharing a joint with a hand in the position of the statue's hand outstretched towards a handshake, but the thumb is painted white. And here, a gatefold reveals an article from the year they dressed McKinley as a choir boy and put him in whiteface. There's the allusion to the thinly veiled racism hidden behind the page, and the marijuana industry rising in the ashes of the logging industry, but also the story of the statue's thumb being sawn from his hand and later recovered and returned by a vagrant who told authorities he had traded it for a spliff on the beach. So indeed, while the vandalism to the statue over the course of the year in which the town made the decision to remove presents new perspective on the thing itself, the reason stories like this need to be in artist books is the marvelous layers that exist between the vast chasm between two sides of a very contentious issue in a very contentious era, both of whom are convinced there can be no nuance at all. Here's a town administrator who quietly organized the 4 a.m. removal on February 29th, 2019. The amazing thing about this story about a statue that was voted out by an electorate that mostly did not really know what McKinley did wrong was across the bay in Eureka 6 months later. The council, in an almost unprecedented action, finally returned Tuluwat Island to the Wiyot people 159 years after they stole it, after that brutal massacre. And McKinley was tangentially responsible for it this time. And how's that for transformation, our theme? And here he is, bedded down on his journey to Ohio, restoration and eventual display somewhere there. I was really excited to have access to make this photograph, and it was just marvelous coincidence that his head came to rest on a tire halo as the man, not the statue, came from Ohio, where the tire industry was one he championed in his political career. So thank you again to everybody. And here are both my personal website and the collective's website if you're interested in exploring more. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to this. This has been it's been lovely to meet the rest of the women in this talk, and Joe, of course, and thank you to the Georgia Book Arts as well as the library for putting on this show. I would love to see it. I have a brother down there, and I hope that he'll be able to go and see it, but we'll see. I had an idea of showing the how-to of how I created this this piece, but instead, what really speaks to my heart is to talk about Emily Bronte and how her language created this piece, how I felt I was in real concert with her to create this piece. But if you're interested in knowing how it opens and closes, and that's quite a transformation. It starts out as a box that's closed up, and it opens up into this 28-inch wide and 13-inch tall sculptural landscape. If you're interested in that, you can go to mermaidbindery.com and poke into my artist book page, and scroll down to where stars is, and you'll see different green buttons, and one of them says presentation videos, and one of them is production images. The presentation videos shows how the piece opens, and there's one that shows how the piece closes. And then the production images is literally, I took a picture every step of the way in my process of creating this piece, and it's one of 10. It's in a small edition of 10. but it goes through color studies and mock-ups and designing of the paste papers and cutting out of all of the materials and all the different jigs to stitch out all the beautiful threads and to create all the pop-up elements and everything. So if you're interested in how everything is put together, I suggest that you go there, mermaidbindery.com. But this piece began with Emily Bronte and a little book from St. Martin's Press. And the first little poem that I found that spoke to me was called And First an Hour. And it's just a small 8-lined poem. But as I was reading through the book more and more, I found stars. And the imagery of the stars poem is just, it's so imaginative, and her language is so colorful. Obviously, as we go around, you'll see more and more of the color, that it really, again, just spoke to me. And learning more about Emily Bronte as I did the piece, which is a common thing. If you're working with another another author's poem, then you really get to know what the life and times of those poets, and kindred spirit, if I can use that quote. She just feels like a kindred spirit to me, and that'll become apparent as I keep talking. But these two poems together, it almost felt like it appeared to me that And First an Hour was a precursor that stars became a more fleshed out version of. And so I decided to write the small poem on the upright structure, and then the larger poem in this circle that goes around, sort of this, creating this universe of her imagery within these two poems. I did try to research if those poems were actually how I feel they are, connected in some way. And I contacted the Bronte Parsonage Museum. So Emily Bronte and her sisters and her father, they grew up in Hawthorne, Yorkshire. And the home that they lived in, their father was a pastor. They've created into a research library and museum for the writings of these three girls, but the father, of course, was a writer as a pastor. Their brother was also a very creative person. I did contact them to see if they might have any idea if these two poems are connected, sort of chronologically, at least, just a hint of whether or not the small one was written before the large one. And they didn't have any kind of answer that they could give me. They did answer me. They were very kind. But my guess is the smaller poem, which And First an Hour is the first 4 letters of the poem, 4 words of the poem. So it gives you an idea that this was maybe not a poem that was large enough to even have its own title. It was just a small poem that was scratched on a piece of paper somewhere, and they didn't necessarily have even a date on that page to know when that was written. And the only thing they knew about stars was when it was actually published in the book that the 3 sisters published together. And they published that under 3 male names, as was usual for the time for female writers. So anyway, I'm going to read through the poem and just give you a showing of the sculpture in circle, and you'll have to see whether you think the 2 poems go together or not. The other topic that came up when I was researching was I wondered what how other people had interpreted the poem of Stars. And what I found in my research was a lot of college-age papers on this poem. And it was rather sexually oriented, thinking that the language that she used was about a tryst or the boy next door, or just something almost as if Emily were exploring her own sexuality. But in my mind, that's not how I interpret this poem at all. I feel that while there are many lines, several lines in the poem that are very passionate and have a very colorful language, that when you take the poem in whole, it's not talking about any particular man or any sort of love affair, except if she were to just, I think what she was in love with was her own imagination, was what she was excited and passionate about was her own being up in her own writer's mind. And you'll find throughout this poem, what I feel it's really about is the age-old drama of, do I really have to get out of bed this morning? Like, this was a woman who was, all three of these girls were self-educated, were self-taught and highly educated. And Emily herself was painfully shy. I don't think that she I didn't get the sense that she was calling out with boys or boys were calling in on her. That they, you know, they kept the house and there was a lot of busy work to be done during the day, but that at night, that was her quiet time to really think about her own poetry and her own creativity. And so I feel that this poem is really a struggle between that time of night when she's able to be quiet and creative, and the daytime where she has to deal with more mundane chores of 19th century women. So anyway, I'll read the poem now, and you can see what you think that might be. So, I'm sorry. And first an hour of mournful musing. Ah, why, because the dazzling sun restored our earth to joy, have you departed every one and left a desert sky? All through the night your glorious eyes were gazing down in mine, and with a full heart's thankful sighs I blessed that watch divine. I was at peace and drank your beams as they were life to me, and reveled in my changeful dreams like petrel on the sea. Thought followed thought, star followed star, through boundless regions on, while one sweet influence near and far thrilled through and proved us one. And then a gush of bitter tears. Why did the morning dawn to break, so great, so pure a spell, and scorch with fire the tranquil cheek where your cool radiance fell? Blood red he rose, and arrow straight, his fierce beams struck my brow. The soul of nature sprang elate, but mine sank sad and low. And then a dreary calm diffusing its deadly mists o'er joys and cares. My lids closed down, yet through their veil I saw him blazing still, and steeped in gold the misty dale and flash upon the hill. I turned me to the pillow then to call back night and see your worlds of solemn light again throb with my heart and me. And then a throb, and then a lightning. It would not do, the pillow glowed both roof and floor, and birds sang loudly in the wood, and fresh winds shook the door. And then a breathing from above. The curtains waved, the wakening flies were murmuring round my room, imprisoned there till I should rise and give them leave to roam. And then a star in heaven brightening, the star, the glorious star of love. O stars and dreams and gentle night, O night and stars return, and hide me from the hostile light that does not warm but burn, that drains the blood of suffering men, drinks tears instead of dew. Let me sleep through his blinding rain and only wake with you. So again, I think that this is really, and I feel it in my own life, that struggle between the need to have quiet time for my creativity and the laundry needs to be done and the dishes need to be done and I need to collect sticks for kindling this winter, and you know, any number of things that we always have to do around the house, but then to quiet ourselves down and to find that time to be really creative can be a struggle, and I feel that this is what her poem is about. The he's, the he's and hims, it's very common to call the sun uh, as a male subject. We think of Mother Earth and the moon as a goddess, and I think that even in our culture, we think of the sun as a male figure. So I think those pronouns are not directed at the boy next door or some sense of uh, longing for a boy. I think it's really what she's talking about is her own creativity. So the last thing I guess I wanted to talk about is that in the works, and let me see if I have from this book as well, I have 2 mock-ups. So this is how my projects kind of start, with like little models and mock-ups. Of the sisters. So in this book, which was, let's see if I can see, published, I'm not going to see when that was. When I think they were sort of in their late 20s, I believe it was. Again, they had to use male names to, let's see, is that close enough? They had to use male names to publish it, because that's how women did it in those days. And a lot of the poetry is influenced by the male writers of the day, because that's really, men were the ones who were writing and being published. And so a lot of their poetry, or some of their poetry, you could tell were similar to men of the age, where we're talking about industry or bloody fields in war or things like this. There were only maybe like, I don't know, 8 poems out of their 36 all put together, all 3 of them contributed. There were only 8 of them that I would say are at least neutral, as far as, it wouldn't, you couldn't tell whether a male or a female would write about that content. And I'm not trying to be terribly sexist, but there were three poems, one from each of them, that were so genuinely feminine and so genuinely from their own hearts. And Stars was one of them. That was Emily's contribution. But the other 2 girls each had a poem as well, that were just so tied to who they were as women, and what they had experienced as young people, and it gave you the sense of what their coping skills became because of their early tragedies. So their mother died when they were very young. The youngest was, I think, Anne was 1 year old, and Charlotte was 5. They were 2 years apart. And then their 2 oldest sisters died when they were away at school. And so there was just a lot of death and tragedy. And then their aunt came to help them, but by the time they were grown, the aunt had also died. I should say that they lived in a parsonage. It was at the bottom of the hill from the church and the graveyard. So at that time, there was a lot of disease, tuberculosis being one of them, and that ended up taking most of the children, and the wife and the aunt, and because that's all running downhill into their groundwater, into their well water. So they were a fairly sickly family. The dad, they think, maybe drank a lot of whiskey instead of water, and that's probably why he outlived all of them. Pretty unfortunate. But so you get a sense from these poems, the character of the girls. Charlotte's poem is called Evening Solace, and it's at a time period of day that's evening, and her character is, okay, we've got to pull things together, we've got to get it done, we've got to make sure everything's in order, and we're going to keep this family together, damn it. That was her coping skill, right? Just to keep it all together. And then Emily, as we talked about, she just dove right into her imaginative mind. She just made universes of her own to dive into as her coping skills. In Memory, we find with Anne that her coping skill was really to sort of put a shinier bent on things than they might have had originally, but also we know from other writings of hers that she just saw the potential in everything. She was the sister that was most into the feminine movement of her time, and to the point where Charlotte, like when after Anne passed away, Charlotte didn't want to publish Anne's most recent work because it just seemed too feminist, I guess. But that's another story. But anyway, the other thing I love about this triptych of pieces that I'm designing is that she's in the evening, she's overnight in wee early morning hours, and she is in the daytime. So it's almost like they sat down together, and they would have done this a lot as writers. They sat down together and decided, let's just pick our favorite times a day. Let's write something that's totally about ourselves or something from our childhood or some, let's really express ourselves and put at least one of those into this book that people think that men wrote. And I just think that that's a really fascinating thing to think on. I have no idea, like I say, I'm not really a literary person. I haven't really researched any of this, but these are questions that pop up when you're designing for other artists' poetry. Anyway, that's my show and tell, and I thank again, and hope you've all enjoyed.
Thank you so much, Colleen. And as a reminder, we do have time for a few questions, so feel free to go ahead and type those in the Q&A section. Before I sort of launch into any of mine, do any of you have questions for each other as you've sat here and heard each other's presentations? And feel free to go ahead and turn on your microphones and your video. That way you'll all sort of like pop up on the screen and we can kind of have a nice chat.
I had a question for Miranda, actually. Your audio was at times muffled, so forgive me if I missed this. There was a book on the left of the bottom shelf behind you that had holes in it, and it had directions, and it looked like it was sun positions, but I was wondering what that book was called and if I was right.
On the higher shelf or on the table?
No, on the first shelf, the wooden shelf.
It was the one with the coordinates, right?
Yeah, it had coordinates and it looked like it had holes in the pages.
This here?
Yeah. No. Yes, that's it. Sorry.
So this is called 100 Coordinates of Violence.
Oh, thank you.
And it started with an installation of 100 pieces of Kitakata paper that I tried to make a shape that would be a whole that would not have any associations. It's really hard. It ended up looking like a hamburger or a tie, but anyway.
Oh, interesting.
And I think it was like 20 by 20 feet when it was installed. And then most of my books, I also have another form. So that was the installation. And this was the first book, a Xerox book that has been, just those drills that they have in copy shops.
Oh, yeah.
Each of these pages has another coordinate of it's not personal violence, it's state violence. So invasions or massacres, things like that. So the idea being with this book, with 1,000 coordinates of violence, that after reasonable research, they're all from this database that started out with 100 and eventually grew to 44,400 and then was reduced. Trying to cut off our defense mechanisms. So I think I vaguely mentioned, we usually say, oh, that's too far away, or that was so long ago. But with this information, you don't have those defenses, but you still have the safety of investigation. The same with these. This, even though you have the text of the invasions or massacres, that's, I think, 4.5 type, and overlay that decorative fleur-de-lis very hard to read, especially if you want to read more than a couple of lines. So you're drawn in, pacified by the decoration. So I'm kind of manipulating you emotionally to try and get you to spend a little time.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
We do have a question, and it kind of dovetails into a question that I have as well. And just to remind everybody that yes, we will post this recording on YouTube, and that way you can view it later at your convenience or review it if you want to do so as well. So Ariane asked the question, and it was directed at Sharon, but I'm going to use it with a question I had since it was so very close. It's like, I love your interpretation of the planet and the changing climate in this medium. The book seems so delicate, which is in stark contrast to the topics you cover. I love the polarity of the two. In keeping with being thoughtful of the environment and resources, how do you seek out the materials you use? And maybe let's also, all of us think about, the inexpensive versus the extravagant. How important is the material to the piece? What comes first, the material or the idea? And in order to get your message across, how do you seek out particular materials, and is money no object in order to really convey your message?
Well, first, I am 100% aware of the hypocrisy of using acrylic in this piece. Like I said, like this book came to me like in this vision. Like I woke up literally in the middle of the night, and like on my phone, I was like, death, destruction, bleeding, unnecessary, like all this stuff, right? And I just had this vision, and I couldn't think of another substrate that I could use that would have the transparency that I wanted for the look that I wanted to convey. One of the reasons that I love encaustic is that it's wax and demar varnish, and it is 100% biodegradable, even though it's completely archival, like it's survived thousands and thousands of years. It has no plastic in it, which I really appreciate. And that's been an important decision. I mean, I do use acrylic and watercolors and oil paints, but my primary medium is encaustic. And that being said, like on this piece on, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name of my notebook. The ink and the gold ink, it's just all about the transition between, like, you start with this small project, like, oh, we're just going to mine for this really, really important metal. And then at the end of the day, like, you've completely decimated the earth. You've enslaved all these people to make this gold, and somebody's getting rich off the back of it, right? So every page is just this transition from one stage to the next, where like if something might start as this kind of innocuous idea, but with supply and demand gets out of control really quickly. The same thing with the glaciers, like one glacier melts, it's like, oh, that's something we should be concerned about. But then when you've got a whole ice sheet coming off of Greenland, all of a sudden it's like, well, what's the water line in Miami going to be 10 years from now? Like it becomes this huge problem that, I feel like my entire life we've been talking about climate change. Yeah. I was born in 1966. I feel like every year we've been talking about climate change, and yet I see no solution, so that's my biggest frustration. Anyways, I'm getting off topic about the product, but and then, the fragility is all about, like, the fragility is about like how fragile our planet is. And really, like, the planet's going to survive. We're the ones who are fragile. We're the ones who are going to be poisoned. We're the ones who are going to lose our food chain supply. And so, like, having this Coptic stitch binding, like, keeps it really loose and like it's going to tip over at any second. Like, that's intentional. Like, everything I choose is intentional. In Fragile Breath, like, there's 7 signatures because 7's the number of heaven. Like, there's just all these thoughts that go into like every step of the way. Did that answer the question? I kind of ramble if I'm not super prepared.
That was perfect. Miranda, what about you in your choice of materials and cost and sustainability?
So most of my books, edition books, I try to make as inexpensively as possible. And with the exception of After Reasonable Research, that paper, it's an Italian paper, but I wanted that fleur-de-lis to reference European royalty. Generally, they're either printed by me or Xeroxed and then sold for $10, $15 each. I was very focused on how I could disseminate these projects, the ideas, outside of a gallery format or some way, the formats that have a lot of gates. And I think that's why if I'm getting into more precious materials, then I'm not always making a book. I'm making a single sheet. So they're still somewhat affordable, and then prints from those that are very affordable. I do think that I want my work to be disseminated before being precious, even though I sometimes use precious materials. I don't think I always use sustainable methods. I'm not sure how sustainable Xeroxing is, although the ink of Xeroxing is carbon. But then there's the issue of paper, which I wonder about too, because I do have an enormous soft spot for trees, and then I'm using all this paper, and we go round and round. Yeah.
It's a bit of a transformation kind of thing. So.
Yes, isn't it?
Exactly. I had to. You set that up too well, so I had to go ahead and throw that in there. Colleen, what about you?
I think, yeah, even the kind of bind, I didn't show other work in my universe, and you can look that up on my website if you want. But I use different methodologies, bindings, and materials for every project. I realize that I happen to be showing two projects that use gray duo fabric heavily, so they make me seem a little bit married to that, but I'm not. I feel like the story that I'm trying to tell always dictates what the form will be. I've made books out of birth control pill boxes. I've made books out of an ore and books that drowned in my flooding basement. So it runs the gamut for me. But I mean, there is one piece of material within the Rolls and Tubes Deluxe Edition that I spoke to briefly about, the idea of having myself and 3 other women as clients rather than making something out of just my heart, although a lot of my heart was in it. I selected an end sheet that I thought really referred to the roundness of the toilet paper roll. When those paste downs came out in the form of the first proof, everyone thought, no, it needs to be more water oriented. And so, we all sort of collectively went searching for the right paste down for that, for example. And I think the solution was much better than mine. I love that paper. I'll use it on something else. I'll find it one day. We all have these secret flat files full of like special materials that we had to have, but don't use.
Well, I ask that question a lot of when we have author events. I know that there are chapters and scenes that are tucked away in drawers, just waiting for that perfect moment of inspiration or to be inserted into that perfect, plot line. And, so I'm glad to see that in all aspects of book art, that we all have that little drawer. Yeah. Joelle, what about you and your materials?
Oh, well, I certainly have drawers like that. My materials, I grew up in the book arts. That was where my first art and my art still is. And so my materials are very bookbinding oriented. I collect papers from a woman named Katie McGregor, who works up in Whiting, Maine. She's quite well known to book artists. Her papers are just so wonderfully structural. Number one, she's a craftsman. She's a consummate artist and craftsman when it comes to her colors and when it comes to the structure of her papers, the content of her rag and whatnot. And they're just absolutely beautiful. But otherwise, the other decorative papers, usually I start with a certain color base and then I'll paste paper. And that's a form of decorating of paper that came out of the time when printing became a thing. And it was a German way. And at that time, marbling paper was a big tradition. And at that time, when more books were being produced and they needed end sheets and something decorative out of the studio of bookbinderies from these new printing presses in Germany, the Germans figured out how to collect the materials they already had in their print studios, which was pigment, which was animal glue and paper. And they figured out how to make paste paper. Some of the early ones was just light pigments mixed in glue. You spread it on wet paper, and which is all a similar process in printing. And then you can make marks in that paste papering. So you probably can't see much by way of textures, but I tend to use dry pigments. So here's some of the color studies that I used. And so I use dry pigments on wet paper and then wipe or brush clear wheat paste over those papers to bind those dry pigments to the paper. And so that's a very cost-effective way for artists to be essentially designing their own landscape, designing their own papers within their books. So the other thing that I often do is I'll stitch. So I can maybe bring that a little bit closer. And if you come to you can see a lot of stitching that goes on, airy swirls in there, the stars that are stitched in the skyline, the mist on the hills. So I use stitching a lot as some of the decorative elements that. But of course, with all of these, I think it was Sharon who was saying it. I think it was, when you're designing a book, like every detail that you can suck out of the writing or the content that you're thinking of, every detail you just jam pack it right into the artist book that you can make. And the more details you have, sort of the richer it is. So the other thing I incorporate always in my own writing is my own writing. So this is all handwritten. And with this particular book, that's my natural cursive. And down here is my natural block print hand. And because I felt so connected to these girls as writers, I just felt I didn't need to do the more formal calligraphy for this one. I wanted it to just be a natural hand because that's how they would have been writing before they send something off to the publisher. They would just, so in general, no, my materials are not very expensive. Katie McGregor papers are worth every penny. Otherwise, the book board and the paper-backed fabrics and the ribbons and the strings and the paper, it's really our expertise as artists and how we pull it all together that makes these pieces precious, I guess, in their own way. So,
and I think that's a fantastic point. Some of the works in the exhibition that are the most powerful are often the smallest pieces we have, or simple accordion fold piece of paper that really make an impact on the people who come and see the shows. That's not saying that a piece like yours is stunning sitting on the table as I look outside of my office. But
I tend to go for structurally sculptural. So if you look on my website, you'll see that while all of my materials are kind of the same, and all the basic bookbinding materials, all my structures are very different, and that's where I have a lot of fun in the building.
Excellent. Well, we are getting almost to the hour and a half point. So maybe let's go around. And I know, Joelle, you're working on a triptych, and I know, Colleen, you are traveling and things like that. But what's next for all of you? What are you sort of like either are working on now, or a great idea that you sort of like have percolating that you're trying to formulate? Sharon, why don't we
Well,
start again?
sure. I have a whole bullet journal of ideas that I'm constantly like fighting with myself of like, if this idea is going to actually like spend the test of time for me to actually complete it. But right now I am working on some sculptural projects. I have this concept of, my husband's a ceramicist, so I'm going to borrow some of his skills. I want to create an installation of monarch cocoons. So I'm working on that. And I'm also working on a crazy sculpture using recycled, like my recycling, and I'm making botanicals, and it all stems from like our mission to Mars. And I was thinking, okay, you're going to go to Mars and there's nothing there. Like, where are the flowers? You're going to have to build them. You're going to build them out of the garbage of whatever you landed on Mars with. So that's kind of the concept.
Wow.
Excellent. Actually, that sounds, both of them sound very, very. Miranda, what are you working on?
I was having a hard time, perhaps like Sharon, with the destruction of climate change. And I also was drawn to do work with rivers, and they were so dark. And I thought, I'm not sure that I really want to make work that's about rivers leaving the earth because we've fucked it up so much. So I sat with that for a while, and instead I'm doing these very, very decorative, which periodically I do to kind of push my femaleness in people's faces. You could say celebrations of rivers. So I've done the Amazon, I've done the Nile. Like the Amazon is titled "The Amazon River in Full Regalia." And the Nile River plays when we're not looking. So underneath that, which I'm not going to write, so this is a secret between us, it's almost like celebrated after their death. So celebrating the life instead of mourning. Anyway, still struggling with it, but I'm enjoying the process. And actually going to bring the other thing that I'm doing, I periodically do work where I ask people to participate. Only like once every 4 or 5 years. And I have about 500 moons that I did, and decided against this enormous moon installation. But what I'm going to do shortly is put on my website. The final work will be only the most important moons, and I will ask people to submit a date or 1 to 3 dates from their life that were really pivotal, and then I will shift those dates to the moment the moon was full, closest to that. And then, so these are, the date will be on there, and I will write the person's name on the back, and I will make 2, and I will send 1 to you, or 1 to 3, however many dates you submit, you get them, and then I keep 1. And I'm looking forward to a nice full wall. But this week, I've decided to go ahead with this, so it's brand new.
Well, I mean, that sounds like a fascinating project on many levels, not only incorporating folks, but, kind of like intimacy of seeing what their pivotal moment is as well.
Yeah, and I love the idea that you could be having this amazing experience, and I could be having a rather mundane day, but the moon is loving both of us.
Oh, excellent, excellent. Colleen, Let's talk to you about your travels, or maybe what else you're working on. Wow.
I've traveled during the talk.
I-
So that's really hard to follow. That's an amazing idea. I'm actually, my travels project probably will be a book, but it's really down the road right now. But what I'm working on book-wise right now is a project that's about my mother's love letters from a man named Marshall Nirenberg in the 1950s. She dated a man who eventually decoded RNA and got a Nobel Prize. And so there are these really interesting letters that she kept that have material about his day-to-day work life. And so right now I'm in between making imagery for this piece and learning to understand the science so that I can make the visual imagery I want to for the work. So I'm really embroiled in that moment that we were just talking about materials and form, of like letting the learning teach me what it's going to look like, or even what's going to be involved. There are photographs, there are scans. There is probably going to be stitching at this point. So I'm an embroiderer on the side. So.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Well, Joelle, I know we saw the triptych earlier, but what else maybe are you working on?
So I actually have a few dozen different projects that are in different sort of thought stages, and this was one of my earlier thoughts. It's common in the book arts world to create, and especially the calligraphy world, to create an abecedarium, your own alphabet essentially. And I've created an alphabet of mermaids. And so this is really just a long mock-up of an accordion that highlights the mermaid alphabet that I've created. I don't know if you can see. I have a broadside companion to that. When I was young, I did a lot of writing in high school, and this is called Interrupted Play. It was about this group of mermaids that were playing, and a shark came by. But I created it into a poem, and so the circle says, ever in motion, ever at play, reveling in the press of currents created. And the rest of the poem says, the eldest freezes, pointing, and that's the letter Z up here. All join his silent cry of warning, intertwining bodies in static safety, drifting until the predator passes, untangling to resume their play. So it was just a story that I had created in my mind about mermaids that sort of turn themselves into kelp when predators come by, essentially. They intertwine and just float, and that's their safety mechanism. But so it occurred to me that I could make these, make these letters into different patterns of mermaids swimming through the letters. So that's one project. It's going to be in a large circular box, and on the top of the box there'll be some sort of an island sculpted. This is just something fun I did in a class, sort of a little sand ocean-y looking thing. So that's one of many that I have. I'm of my own writings as well as other authors' writings.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, ladies, it was an absolute fascinating evening, and it was just wonderful to meet you all and to talk with you more about art. I know that some of you have visited this show, some of you were planning to visit the show. I can't tell you what a joy it is to have an office that sort of like sits in the middle of all of that, because I secretly get to enjoy it every day of the week, even when the gallery is closed. But once again, a reminder to everyone this evening, do stop by and check out the exhibition during gallery hours, or go ahead and contact us and we can try and accommodate you on non-gallery days. Once again, thank you so much, Sharon and Miranda, Colleen, and Joelle, for taking the time out this evening. And thank you to all of you for taking the time out of your lives and letting us come into your homes this evening as well. Once again, thank you to the Decatur Arts Alliance, and we hope to see you at Book as Art Transformation. Have a wonderful evening.